Let's cut to the truth. When a dismissive avoidant walks away, it can feel like they vanished without a trace. No closure, no explanation, just gone, and you're left spinning, wondering what you did wrong, what they were feeling, and whether this is really the end or just another disappearing act. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on what's actually going on inside the mind of a dismissive avoidant when they say that final goodbye. Because their silence, it's saying a lot. You just need to know how to hear it. This isn't about blame. This is about clarity. It's about getting real with how avoidant attachment works, why they leave, and whether they'll ever come back. So if you're stuck in the cycle of replaying what happened, this is your moment to stop guessing and start understanding. Dismissive avoidant attachment is rooted in a deep psychological framework that begins forming in early childhood. People with this attachment style have typically grown up in environments where emotional needs were minimized, ignored, or even punished. As a result, they learned often unconsciously that relying on others for emotional support is unsafe or ineffective. Instead, they developed a strong sense of independence and self-sufficiency, believing that they must take care of themselves emotionally and that closeness to others comes with a cost. This background forms the foundation of the traits we see in dismissive avoidance, especially in adult relationships. One of the most defining characteristics of a dismissive avoidant is their intense need for space and autonomy. While they may enter relationships like anyone else, there is often a subtle emotional wall that keeps others from getting too close. This is not about playing games or being manipulative. Rather, it's a defense mechanism. Emotional closeness feels risky to them. They may worry often on a subconscious level that being vulnerable will lead to being controlled, criticized, or abandoned. So instead of letting someone in, they keep their emotional world locked down, presenting a surface that can seem calm, detached, and even indifferent. This emotional distance often manifests in practical ways. A dismissive avoidant might be highly focused on their career, hobbies, or personal goals. Not because those things are inherently more important, but because they're safer. Work doesn't demand emotional intimacy. A project can't hurt you. Success doesn't ask you to reveal your fears. So these individuals tend to gravitate toward things that offer a sense of control, predictability, and solitude. Relationships, by contrast, are messy, unpredictable, and emotionally demanding. Everything a dismissive avoidant has learned to avoid. Another trait commonly seen is a discomfort with deep emotional conversations. Dismissive avoidants tend to downplay or dismiss both their own emotions and those of others. If a partner brings up concerns or wants to talk about the relationship, the avoidant might shut down, get defensive, or change the subject. They're not trying to be cruel, they're overwhelmed. Emotional discussions can feel like a threat to their carefully maintained distance. They may interpret emotional needs as clinginess or pressure, and instead of moving toward connection, they pull away to regain their sense of safety. This can be incredibly confusing for their partners. In the early stages of a relationship, a dismissive avoidant might appear charming, confident, and even affectionate. But as the bond deepens and emotional intimacy increases, their discomfort can start to show. They might begin withdrawing, criticizing their partner, or becoming less available both physically and emotionally. This pattern can leave their partner feeling like the rug has been pulled out from under them, unsure of what changed or what they did wrong. But from the dismissive avoidance perspective, the problem isn't the partner, it's the vulnerability that closeness demands. Trust is another major issue for dismissive avoidance. While they may say they want love and connection, they often struggle to believe that others will be there for them in a consistent and non-judgmental way. They may secretly fear being dependent on someone else, associating it with weakness or loss of control. As a result, they rarely let people see their true emotional selves, preferring instead to maintain a polished exterior. This leads to shallow or surface-level connections, which are less risky but also far less fulfilling for both them and their partner. Ironically, many dismissive avoidants do feel deeply. They're not emotionless or cold, as they're sometimes labeled. The truth is, they often experience strong emotions, but they don't know how to process or express them in healthy ways. Instead, they bury them, suppress them, or channel them into solitary activities. In moments of high stress or conflict, they may retreat entirely, disappearing for days or even weeks, needing time alone to reset. This withdrawal isn't necessarily about punishment or indifference. It's about self-preservation. Because of all these traits, dismissive avoidants often struggle with consistency in relationships. They might say they want connection but behave in ways that push it away. They might initiate closeness and then pull back abruptly when it becomes too intense. They might even end relationships that seem to be going well, not because they don't care, but because caring feels too vulnerable, too threatening. The more they feel, the more their protective instincts kick in. It's also worth noting that dismissive avoidants are not intentionally trying to hurt anyone. Their behaviors are protective, not malicious. Most of the time, they're not even fully aware of their attachment style or how it impacts others. They're acting from old programming, beliefs formed long before they had the capacity to challenge or change them. That's why awareness is the first step toward healing, both for them and for anyone in a relationship with them. The core traits of a dismissive avoidant: emotional distance, self-sufficiency, discomfort with vulnerability, fear of dependence, and a tendency to withdraw, are not random or personal. They're rooted in early experiences and reinforced over time. Understanding these traits doesn't excuse hurtful behavior, but it does explain it. And in that understanding lies the power to make clearer, more compassionate choices for both sides, whether that means setting boundaries, seeking therapy, or walking away. Knowledge is the first step to breaking the cycle. Emotional closeness is something many people naturally seek in relationships. It's what helps us feel seen, supported, and loved. But for someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style, emotional closeness can feel like a threat rather than a comfort. Their early life experiences often taught them that being vulnerable, showing emotions, or relying on others was either ineffective or even dangerous. Maybe they had caregivers who were emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, critical, or dismissive of their needs. Over time, they learned to protect themselves by becoming emotionally self-sufficient. And that protection mechanism carries over into adult relationships in powerful, often unconscious ways. When emotional closeness starts to grow in a relationship through intimacy, vulnerability, or consistent care, it triggers alarm bells in a dismissive avoidant. While they may want connection on some level, the idea of truly letting someone in feels overwhelming. They associate closeness with a loss of control, an erosion of their boundaries, or even a fear of being engulfed. Instead of leaning into the connection, they back away, sometimes subtly by becoming less emotionally available or more aloof, other times dramatically by picking fights, withdrawing, or ending the relationship altogether. This reaction isn't because they don't care. In fact, many dismissive avoidants do care deeply. They just don't know how to manage the emotional intensity that closeness brings. They've spent most of their lives avoiding these feelings. And when a partner gets too close, it threatens the internal structure they've built to feel safe. They may start to see the other person as needy, overwhelming, or even suffocating, not because the partner has changed, but because the growing intimacy is pushing them into unfamiliar territory. What feels nurturing to one person can feel invasive to someone with a dismissive avoidant lens. Another part of this dynamic is the internal conflict that gets activated. The dismissive avoidant may have genuine feelings for their partner. They might want the relationship to work. But the closer they get, the more their internal defense system kicks in. They might start to criticize the relationship or focus on flaws in their partner, sometimes small things blown out of proportion. This is a subconscious attempt to create distance, to justify pulling back, to find a reason to retreat without acknowledging that vulnerability is what's really scaring them. One of the most confusing things for their partner is how inconsistent this can all look. One moment, the dismissive avoidant might be loving and engaged. The next, distant and cold. This hot and cold behavior isn't meant to confuse or manipulate. It's a sign of an internal push-pull dynamic. They want closeness, but fear it. They crave connection, but resist dependence, so they move forward, then backward. They open up, then shut down. This emotional whiplash is exhausting for both people, and unless the avoidant is willing to do the inner work of healing, the pattern tends to repeat in every relationship. When conflict arises, and it always does in relationships, the dismissive avoidance reaction is often to shut down or withdraw. Rather than working through the issue together, they might go silent, avoid communication, or physically distance themselves. This isn't necessarily about punishment or control. It's about emotional overload. Conflict means dealing with feelings, and feelings are what they've spent their whole lives trying to keep under wraps. So the instinct is to escape rather than engage. This withdrawal is often misinterpreted by their partners as coldness, apathy, or lack of love. But again, it's not about not caring, it's about not knowing how to stay connected when emotions get intense. The dismissive avoidant is trying to calm their internal system by retreating, but in doing so, they unintentionally trigger abandonment wounds in others, especially those with anxious attachment styles. And so begins the cycle. The anxious partner pursues, trying to restore closeness. The avoidant pulls further away, trying to preserve space. Both end up feeling misunderstood and unsafe. Another important element is how dismissive avoidants interpret emotional expression. When a partner opens up about their feelings, especially if those feelings are directed at the relationship or the avoidant's behavior, it can feel like an attack. They may see it as criticism, manipulation, or an attempt to control them, even if it's simply a vulnerable expression of hurt or longing. This distorted perception comes from their own discomfort with emotional needs, which they've long been taught to suppress or ignore. As a result, they often invalidate their partner's emotions, not out of cruelty, but because they don't know how to meet emotional needs without feeling overwhelmed. For the dismissive avoidant, the safest emotional distance is often just out of reach. They want the connection to exist, but not in a way that requires too much from them. They prefer relationships where independence is high, expectations are low, and emotional intensity is minimal. While this setup might seem peaceful to them, it usually leaves their partners feeling starved for emotional intimacy. What's important to recognize is that this isn't a fixed or permanent way of being. Attachment styles are not life sentences. They're learned patterns, and anything learned can be unlearned. But it does require self-awareness, willingness to explore painful emotional territory, and often the help of therapy or relational work. Until then, the pattern of pushing away closeness will continue to play out, no matter how strong the connection seems on the surface. Understanding why emotional closeness triggers withdrawal in a dismissive avoidant is key to navigating or choosing to exit relationships with this dynamic. It's not about forcing them to change or proving your worth. It's about recognizing their internal struggle for what it is, a deep fear of vulnerability disguised as independence. And once you see that clearly, you can start to make informed, compassionate choices about your needs, your boundaries, and your path forward. When someone with a dismissive, avoidant attachment style leaves a relationship, it often feels sudden, confusing, and deeply personal to the partner left behind. You might replay every conversation, every moment, trying to find what you did wrong. But the truth is, in most cases, the reason they leave has far more to do with their internal world than anything you said or did. It's important to understand that their departure is not necessarily a reflection of your worth, your effort, or the quality of the relationship. It's a reflection of their fear, specifically their fear of emotional intimacy, vulnerability, and dependence. Dismissive avoidants are driven by a deep need for emotional self-protection. Early in life, they likely learned that expressing needs, showing emotion, or depending on others led to disappointment, criticism, or even emotional neglect. So they adapted by shutting down those needs, telling themselves they don't need anyone and that relying on others is risky or weak. As adults, this leads to a powerful desire for independence and control, not because they don't want love, but because they don't trust it to last or to be safe. In the early stages of a relationship, everything might seem fine, even great. Dismissive avoidants often come across as confident, self-sufficient, and easygoing. They might enjoy the novelty and excitement of a new connection, especially when it doesn't yet require deep emotional intimacy. But as the relationship progresses and emotional closeness grows, their internal alarm system starts to activate. What felt exciting and light suddenly starts to feel heavy and demanding. Vulnerability creeps in, expectations build, and that's when the fear sets in. To a dismissive avoidant, emotional closeness can feel like a trap. The more someone wants to connect, the more the avoidant feels the need to retreat. They start perceiving closeness as a threat to their independence, rather than a source of comfort. Often without realizing it, they begin to emotionally disengage. They might become distant, less affectionate, more critical, or increasingly focused on their own routines and interests. These shifts aren't calculated, they're defensive. The avoidant is trying to reestablish emotional distance to feel safe again. And the distance doesn't feel like enough, when the relationship still feels too close, too demanding, or too vulnerable, the avoidant may choose to end it. But instead of explaining this internal conflict, they often leave abruptly or quietly, giving vague reasons like, "I'm just not ready, I need space," or "something doesn't feel right." Sometimes they don't say anything at all. They just disappear, leaving the other person confused and hurt. This exit strategy serves two purposes. It relieves their emotional overwhelm, and it helps them avoid the vulnerability of confrontation or emotional explanation. What's especially painful for the person left behind is that it often feels like they were discarded. One day things seemed fine, and the next, the avoidant is gone. There's no closure, no honest conversation, just silence or detachment. But again, this behavior isn't about you being unlovable or not enough. It's about the avoidant feeling emotionally flooded and not having the tools or the willingness to work through it. They leave to protect themselves, not to punish you. This can be difficult to accept, especially if you are open, consistent, and emotionally available in the relationship. It's natural to want to make sense of it by blaming yourself or trying to figure out what you could have done differently. But trying to decode someone else's emotional walls doesn't bring healing. It just keeps you stuck in a cycle of self-doubt. What's important to recognize is that the dismissive avoidant's decision to leave was likely brewing long before the final goodbye. They may have started emotionally distancing themselves weeks or months earlier, even if they didn't verbalize it. The leaving is often the last step in a process of silent withdrawal. One of the hardest truths to come to terms with is this: you can be an amazing partner and still be unable to change someone's attachment style. You can show up with love, patience, and emotional depth, and still not be enough to convince someone who is deeply afraid of intimacy to stay. Not because you failed, but because they're not ready. Their internal wiring is telling them to run before they get hurt, to disconnect before they become too dependent, to shut the door before it feels out of their control. That's not your fault. That's their story, their programming, their work to do. The path to healing, both for them and for you, starts with understanding that their leaving was not about your worth. It was about their fear. If a dismissive avoidant is ever going to sustain a healthy, intimate relationship, they will need to confront that fear, often through therapy or deep self-reflection. They'll need to unlearn the idea that closeness equals danger and relearn that intimacy can be safe, supportive, and secure. Until that happens, the cycle will repeat in every relationship they enter. So if you've been left by someone who seemed to check out emotionally, then vanished, know this: you're not broken, and you weren't too much. You were just with someone who wasn't able to meet you where you were. They didn't leave because you asked for love or honesty. They left because they weren't ready to give it, and that's not on you. When a dismissive avoidant ends a relationship, their response to the breakup can look incredibly different from what most people expect. From the outside, it often appears like they move on quickly and effortlessly. There's little emotional display, no obvious signs of regret or grief, and sometimes they even seem happier or more relaxed once the relationship ends. To someone who's been left behind, especially if that person is still emotionally raw, this reaction can feel cold, even inhuman. But what's actually happening beneath the surface is far more complex, and understanding how dismissive avoidance process breakups reveals just how deeply their attachment style influences every stage of a relationship, including the end. Dismissive avoidants are skilled at compartmentalizing their emotions. This coping strategy starts early in life, often in response to caregivers who are emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, or critical. To survive emotionally, they learn to suppress their needs and detach from their feelings. Instead of seeking comfort when hurt or sad, they withdrew. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. As adults, when something emotionally painful occurs, like a breakup, their instinct is not to dive into those feelings, but to block them out. That's why they may seem unaffected on the outside, even if the relationship was significant. Unlike securely attached individuals who tend to process emotional experiences in real time, talking them through, seeking support, reflecting on what went wrong, dismissive avoidants often bypass this phase entirely. They disconnect, distract, or busy themselves with work, hobbies, or new interests. Their goal, whether they realize it or not, is emotional regulation through avoidance. They try to restore equilibrium not by confronting the pain, but by escaping it. This doesn't mean they don't feel loss or sadness. It means they don't know how to handle it safely, so they shut it down. One key difference in how avoidants process breakups is timing. While others may feel the pain immediately, dismissive avoidants tend to experience a delayed emotional response. if they allow themselves to feel it at all. In the early weeks or months after a breakup, they might feel relieved, free, or even indifferent. But that's often a defense mechanism at play, a way to keep vulnerable feelings out of reach. Over time, especially if they aren't distracted by a new relationship or consuming project, those suppressed feelings can resurface. When the reality of loss catches up with them, it may come in the form of nostalgia, regret, or unexpected emotional waves. It's also important to understand how their internal narrative protects them. Dismissive avoidants often rewrite the story of the relationship in a way that helps them maintain emotional distance. They may focus on the flaws of the relationship or the other person's neediness, convincing themselves that leaving was the right and only choice. This narrative serves to shut down any cognitive dissonance or guilt they might feel. Instead of acknowledging mutual issues or their own role in the breakdown, they zero in on reasons why closeness wasn't sustainable. It's not done with malice, it's a form of self-preservation. Avoidants also struggle with introspection, especially when it involves uncomfortable emotions. After a breakup, they are unlikely to sit with their pain and ask, "What did this trigger in me?" Or "What patterns am I repeating?" These kinds of questions require emotional vulnerability and self-awareness. Two areas where dismissive avoidants are often underdeveloped. That's why true growth for them is difficult without intentional effort or outside support, like therapy. Without that, they tend to move from one relationship to the next, repeating the same avoidance patterns without truly processing the loss or learning from it. Another thing that often goes unnoticed is the way avoidants use rationalization as a shield. They approach breakups with a logical mindset, trying to explain things in practical terms. "We weren't compatible. I need to focus on myself," or "I just wasn't ready," are common refrains. While there may be truth in these statements, they also serve to keep emotional messiness at bay. By intellectualizing the breakup, they avoid confronting the raw feelings underneath, feelings of inadequacy, fear, vulnerability, or grief. This entire emotional shutdown can be especially confusing for their ex-partners. If you are deeply connected to someone and they seem to bounce back instantly, it's easy to question whether the connection was ever real. But emotional numbing doesn't mean there was no attachment. It means the avoidant doesn't feel safe enough to experience it fully. And in many cases, if and when they do feel the loss, it comes long after the relationship has ended, when it's too late to repair the damage. Sometimes dismissive avoidants will try to reconnect later, not because they've worked through their issues, but because the emotional void eventually catches up with them. They might begin to miss the comfort of the relationship or feel lonely when their distractions no longer satisfy. But unless they've done real inner work, they tend to repeat the same push-pull behavior that drove the relationship to end in the first place. This cycle can be incredibly frustrating and painful for the other person who may have finally begun to heal or move on. The way a dismissive avoidant processes a breakup isn't heartless, it's deeply self-protective. Their emotional detachment isn't about not caring, it's about not knowing how to care and stay safe at the same time. Understanding this doesn't make the pain of their withdrawal easier, but it does offer a clearer picture of what's really going on. And with that clarity, you can begin to shift your focus away from their silence and toward your own healing. Because no matter how they process the breakup, your path forward doesn't have to be tied to their emotional limitations. When a dismissive avoidant ends a relationship, they may seem resolute at first, firm in their decision, emotionally detached, and even relieved. But time has a way of unearthing the feelings they initially pushed aside. The question so many people ask in the wake of being left by someone with this attachment style is, will they come back? The answer is complicated because while dismissive avoidants often do return in some form, it rarely happens the way you'd hope, and it almost never brings the lasting emotional intimacy people long for. Dismissive avoidants tend to revisit past relationships not because they've had a sudden emotional awakening, but because the distance they created finally feels safe enough to allow some feelings to emerge. When they're no longer emotionally overwhelmed, they can begin to access the positive memories, the comfort, and even the attachment that they previously suppressed. This doesn't mean they fully processed the breakup or grew from it. It means they missed the connection, but on their terms, in a way that doesn't threaten their emotional boundary. Their return might come as a friendly message, a casual check-in, or an unexpected show of interest. It can feel confusing, especially if they seemed completely shut down before. You might think they've had time to reflect, that they've realized what they lost, or that they're ready to meet you emotionally where you are. But in most cases, what's happening is not a change in emotional capacity. It's just a shift in their comfort level. Now that the relationship is no longer active and emotionally intense, they feel safe enough to re-engage. This is one of the most important things to understand about dismissive avoidance. They are often only able to connect when the emotional stakes are low. Once things feel emotionally charged again, if real intimacy, vulnerability, or expectations return, their old defenses come back online. They may ghost again, become distant, or pull away without explanation. This doesn't necessarily mean they're playing games. It's that their attachment system is wired to retreat from emotional exposure. So while their return can feel promising, it's often just the start of another cycle. For someone on the receiving end of this, the emotional roller coaster can be brutal. You might get your hopes up, believing that this time will be different, that maybe the space gave them clarity. But unless they've done deep work on themselves, whether through therapy, self-reflection, or conscious relational effort, their core avoidance remains intact. They might genuinely care about you. They might even want to reconnect. But wanting connection and being able to sustain emotional intimacy are two very different things. It's also common for dismissive avoidance to reappear when they feel lonely, especially if they haven't formed a new relationship that meets their needs for companionship and validation. This doesn't mean they've realized you're the one. It means they're reaching out for comfort in the only way they know how, through brief connection that doesn't demand too much. Unfortunately, this often leads to a cycle where you feel used or strung along because their return lacks the emotional depth and accountability needed for real reconciliation. Another key dynamic is how dismissive avoidants interpret your emotional availability. If you're warm, open, and forgiving when they return, they may initially respond positively. But once again, as the emotional closeness builds, they can begin to feel threatened. Their internal system tells them, this is getting too close again. You're losing control. They're going to expect something from you. And so they retreat. It's not a matter of willpower, it's their emotional blueprint in action. This cycle can be especially difficult for people with anxious attachment styles, who often crave reassurance and connection after the pain of abandonment. The avoidance return might feel like validation or hope, but it's rarely sustainable unless both parties have done significant emotional work. Without that, the relationship gets caught in an exhausting loop of connection and withdrawal, leaving both people feeling misunderstood, disappointed, and emotionally depleted. Sometimes dismissive avoidance do change, but it's important to be realistic about what that change looks like. It requires more than just time or missing someone. It involves confronting the deeply rooted fears that drive their avoidance. Fear of vulnerability, fear of dependence, fear of being seen emotionally. It requires unlearning years of conditioning that taught them to equate emotional closeness with danger or suffocation. And most importantly, it requires willingness. Without the desire to heal and grow, even the strongest connection will eventually buckle under the weight of unresolved fear. So, will they come back? Maybe. But the more meaningful question is, will they come back in a way that's different from before? That answer depends on whether they've confronted their avoidant patterns and whether they're willing to meet you in the emotional space you need. If not, their return may be short-lived, confusing, and ultimately damaging to your healing. You deserve consistency. You deserve emotional safety. You deserve someone who leans in, not out, when things get close. And while it's okay to acknowledge the pain and complexity of missing someone avoidant, your healing begins when you stop hoping they'll be different without the work and start choosing what's truly healthy for you. Healing from a relationship with a dismissive avoidant can be one of the most disorienting emotional journeys you'll ever go through. The aftermath doesn't always look dramatic on the surface, but inside it's often a storm of confusion, self-doubt, and aching questions that never quite get answered. It's not just the loss of the person that hurts, it's the way they left, the silence that followed, and the way they seemed to move on without looking back. You're left holding the emotional weight of a relationship that felt real to you but seemed so easy for them to walk away from. And that's where the deeper work begins. Not just getting over someone, but truly understanding what happened and reclaiming your emotional center. The first part of healing involves understanding the nature of the relationship itself. Dismissive avoidants are wired to pull away when intimacy deepens. If you're someone who craves connection, closeness, and open communication, Being with someone avoidant can feel like constantly reaching out and finding only emptiness. You may have tried harder, stayed longer, loved deeper, hoping it would open them up. But the truth is, no amount of love can undo a pattern they aren't ready to confront. Understanding this doesn't mean dismissing your feelings. It means shifting the blame away from yourself. You didn't cause their emotional withdrawal. You just touched parts of them that they weren't ready to face. This leads to one of the hardest realizations. The closure you want from them may never come. People often wait for some explanation, an apology, or even acknowledgement. But avoidants typically leave without much emotional unpacking. They don't say goodbye the way you need them to, and trying to chase that closure often results in more frustration and pain. Healing then becomes about giving yourself the closure they couldn't. It means telling yourself the truth. They wouldn't say aloud that their leaving wasn't because you weren't enough, but because closeness felt unsafe to them. That truth is painful, but it's also the key to freeing yourself from the cycle of self-blame. Another part of healing is sitting with the grief, not rushing to fix it, numb it, or explain it away. There's a unique kind of sorrow that comes with being emotionally available to someone who couldn't reciprocate. You didn't just lose them, you lost the future you imagined, the version of them you hoped would show up, the connection you tried to build. That grief deserves to be honored. It's real, and it has to be felt, not bypassed. Many people rush into another relationship, hoping to overwrite the pain. But healing from an avoidant relationship requires a different kind of patience. You need time not just to move on, but to recalibrate, to return to yourself. That recalibration starts by examining your own attachment patterns. Often, people who get entangled with avoidance have anxious tendencies. They seek closeness, reassurance, and emotional connection, sometimes from people who can't provide it. This isn't about fault. It's about awareness. When you start to understand your own triggers, needs, and tendencies, you stop making those needs someone else's responsibility. You stop choosing people who are emotionally unavailable, hoping they'll finally see your worth. Instead, you begin to recognize your worth as inherent, whether or not someone else is capable of meeting you in that space. Boundaries become essential in this healing process. Boundaries with your thoughts, your emotions, and especially with the avoidant person if they try to come back. It's easy to fall into old patterns when they reappear, when they send a message or show interest again. You might think, maybe this time it will be different. But if nothing has changed in how they relate emotionally, the cycle will repeat. Healing means drawing a line even when it hurts and protecting the progress you've made. It means choosing peace over potential. It means understanding that consistency, emotional safety, and mutual effort are not luxuries. They're the foundation of healthy love. Another powerful part of healing is reconnecting with yourself, not just who you were before the relationship, but the version of you that you were always meant to become. Avoidant relationships can make you shrink. You may have spent so much time trying to decode their behavior, walking on emotional eggshells, or proving your worth that you forgot your own voice. Now is the time to rediscover that voice. Reconnect with your passions, your friendships, your sense of joy and play. Begin building a life that feels full and meaningful, not as a distraction from heartbreak, but as a homecoming to yourself. Therapy or journaling can also be transformative here. They offer a space to unpack the layers of emotional residue that avoidant dynamics leave behind: abandonment wounds, self-worth doubts, and patterns of emotional chasing. These tools help you shift from simply surviving the loss to actually understanding it. And in that understanding, you start to grow stronger. You start to realize that the person who left may not have been capable of truly seeing you, not because you're unseeable, but because they were afraid to look too closely. You deserve to be seen, fully, consistently, without conditions. The final phase of healing is choosing differently. That doesn't mean swearing off love or guarding your heart with steel. It means loving with discernment. It means recognizing red flags early, not as dramatic warning signs, but as subtle cues of emotional unavailability. It means trusting your gut when it says, I don't feel safe here. And most importantly, it means being the secure, loving presence for yourself that you once hoped someone else would be. Healing from a dismissive, avoidant relationship is not linear. There will be setbacks, longings, and moments of grief that resurface unexpectedly. But each time you honor your feelings instead of denying them, each time you choose yourself instead of chasing someone who won't, you're rewriting the story. You're healing not just from them, but from every pattern that told you love had to be earned. The truth is, the kind of love you want, safe, mutual, deeply connected, is still out there. But it starts with giving it to yourself first. Healing from a relationship with a dismissive avoidant is not just about understanding why they left. It's about reclaiming your power in the aftermath. Yes, they may have exited without explanation, without closure, and without the emotional presence you deserved. But their inability to stay, to connect, or to love in a consistent and secure way is not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their limitations. What you wanted wasn't too much, it was just right for the right person. And that person will not flinch when things get close. They will stay, they will show up, and they will meet you emotionally, not just when it's easy, but when it's real. This journey, as painful and confusing as it may be, is an invitation to grow, to break old patterns, to understand your own attachment wounds and begin the work of healing them. It's a chance to stop chasing people who can't meet you where you are and start choosing relationships built on mutual respect, openness, and emotional safety. The avoidant may come back. They often do. But now you know. What matters most isn't whether they return, it's whether they're capable of showing up differently. And if they're not, you now have the strength and clarity to let them go. Because your peace is not negotiable. Your heart deserves more than fragments, and your healing begins the moment you stop waiting for them to understand and start choosing yourself instead.